I never thought I'd be the type of person to have an affair. Back when James and I were high school sweethearts, planning our future together with all that naive certainty teenagers have, I genuinely believed we'd be different from all those couples who fell apart. We got married right after graduation, had Tiffany when I was barely 21, then Dylan 2 years later. For the longest time, I thought I was living the perfect life everyone else envied. 22 years of marriage teaches you things about yourself you never expected to learn. Like how you can love someone and still feel completely invisible to them. James has always been the responsible one, the planner, the guy who color codes his filing system and gets genuinely excited about retirement portfolios. I used to find it endearing, the way he'd spend entire weekends organizing our finances or researching the best insurance policies. Now I realize it was just another way for him to avoid actually connecting with me. The kids grew up, moved out, started their own lives, and suddenly it was just James and me rattling around in our perfectly maintained house with our perfectly balanced checkbook and our perfectly predictable routine. He'd come home from work, ask me about my day without really listening to the answer, then disappear into his home office to work on whatever project was consuming him that week. I'd sit in the living room watching shows he had no interest in, feeling like a ghost in my own life. That's the thing nobody tells you about long marriages. They can die so slowly, you don't even notice you're attending the funeral. James wasn't cruel, or abusive, or even particularly neglectful by most standards. He just treated our marriage like another item on his to-do list, something that could run on autopilot while he focused on what he considered more pressing matters. Benjamin started working in our department about 10 years ago, and for the first 7 years he was just another colleague. Nice enough, funny in meetings, the kind of guy who remembered your birthday and always contributed to office gift collections. He was married then, seemed happy enough, talked about his kids the way most parents do. I barely registered him as anything more than a friendly face in the break room. Everything changed 3 years ago when his divorce was finalized. Not immediately, I'm not that kind of person, despite what everyone probably thinks now. But Benjamin was going through hell, dealing with custody arrangements and lawyers and trying to figure out how to rebuild his entire life. He needed someone to talk to, and apparently, I was a good listener. Better than his ex-wife had been, he said. Better than most people. We started having coffee together, just as friends. He'd tell me about the challenges of co-parenting, the loneliness of his empty apartment, how strange it felt to be starting over in his 40s. I'd listen and offer advice, maybe share some of my own frustrations about feeling stuck in a marriage that had become more like a business partnership than a romance. It felt good to be needed, to have someone actually pay attention when I spoke. The first time Benjamin told me I was beautiful, really looked at me when he said it, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just attraction, but recognition. Like I existed as more than just James's wife or the kid's mother, or another employee in our department. I was Emily, a woman worth noticing, worth appreciating, worth making an effort for. I know how this sounds. I know exactly what people would say about a middle-aged married woman getting her head turned by compliments and attention. But they weren't living my life, sleeping next to someone who hadn't really seen me in years, going through the motions of a relationship that had all the passion of a business meeting. The emotional affair lasted months before anything physical happened. We'd text throughout the day, little messages that made me smile and feel connected to someone who actually cared about my thoughts and feelings. Benjamin would ask about my weekend plans, remember things I'd mentioned wanting to do, suggest movies he thought I'd enjoy, simple things that James had stopped doing years ago. When Benjamin got married to Alice, I thought maybe that would end whatever was developing between us. Instead, it just made everything more complicated. He'd complain about feeling trapped again, about Alice's expectations and demands, about how quickly his new marriage was starting to feel like his old one. I understood completely. We were both stuck in situations that looked perfect from the outside, but felt suffocating from within. The first time we kissed was in the parking lot, after a particularly late work meeting. Nothing planned or dramatic, Just two people who'd been circling each other for months, finally acknowledging what was happening between us. I drove home that night feeling more alive than I had in years, even as part of me knew I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. We were careful, especially once things became physical. Benjamin found hotels in the next town over, about 2 hours from home, where nobody would recognize us. We used fake names, paid cash, kept everything completely separate from our real lives. I became an expert at creating believable excuses. Late meetings, shopping trips with friends who were out of town, work conferences that didn't actually exist. The deception was easier than I expected. James trusted me completely, never questioned my explanations, never seemed to notice when I came home later than usual or spent extra time getting ready for what I claimed were ordinary workdays. Why would he suspect anything? In his mind, we had a solid marriage, a stable life, a relationship that didn't require constant monitoring or worry. For 3 years, I managed to maintain both lives without either one suffering. I was still a good wife to James, still handled my share of household responsibilities, still showed up for family events and social obligations. But I also had this other life, this secret world where I felt valued and desired and genuinely happy. Benjamin and I would spend hours talking about everything, our dreams, our disappointments, our plans for a future that seemed impossible but felt more real than anything else in my life. The system we developed was sophisticated. We had special phones for communicating, used apps that automatically deleted messages, developed codes for when we could and couldn't talk. I became an expert at reading James's schedule, knowing exactly when I could slip away without raising suspicion. Benjamin was equally careful, managing his own complex web of alibis and excuses. I should have known it couldn't last forever. 3 years of secret meetings, stolen afternoons, carefully orchestrated lies, something was bound to slip eventually. But I'd gotten so good at compartmentalizing, so confident in my ability to manage both relationships, that I genuinely believed I could keep it going indefinitely. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday afternoon, when James called while Benjamin and I were having lunch at our favorite restaurant in Millbrook, the little town where we'd been meeting for over a year. We just ordered, were sitting in our usual corner booth, when my phone rang. James never called during the day unless something was important, so I answered immediately. "Hey, where are you?" he asked, and something in his tone made me instantly cautious. "At the office," I said automatically, the lie rolling off my tongue like it had hundreds of times before. "Just grabbing a quick bite in the break room. Why?" "I tried calling your office line, but it went straight to voicemail." My heart rate picked up slightly, but I kept my voice casual. "I'm actually in the bathroom. You know how the reception is in there. Is everything okay?" We talked for maybe 2 minutes about some boring household issue, and I thought I'd handled it perfectly. Benjamin raised an eyebrow when I hung up, and I just shrugged. "James being James," I said, and we went back to our conversation about the weekend getaway we were planning. I had no idea that James's friend Ralph had spotted us from across the restaurant, had watched me take that phone call while sitting intimately close to a man who definitely wasn't my husband. I had no idea that Ralph had immediately called James, that my perfect system was already crumbling around me. For the next 6 weeks, I continued my normal routine, completely oblivious to the fact that James had hired a private investigator to follow me. Benjamin and I met twice a week as usual, continued our careful dance of hotel reservations and cover stories, maintained our separate phones, and deleted message trails. I was so confident in my methods, so sure that James was too trusting and predictable to ever suspect anything. The private investigator was good at his job. He documented our hotel visits, photographed us together, gathered enough evidence to paint a very clear picture of what had been going on. But James wasn't satisfied with just the recent evidence. Somehow, he managed to install monitoring software on my phone, giving him access to years of messages I thought I'd deleted, including some very explicit conversations from our early days that I'd forgotten about. While James was methodically building his case against me, I was planning what I thought would be a wonderful surprise birthday party for myself. I'd been dropping hints for months about wanting a big celebration, something special to mark another year. James seemed receptive to the idea, even enthusiastic, which should have been my first clue that something was wrong. James hated parties, avoided social gatherings whenever possible, and definitely wasn't the type to organize elaborate celebrations. But I was so focused on my double life, so consumed with managing my relationship with Benjamin while maintaining my marriage to James, that I completely missed the signs. When James started asking about guest lists, suggesting we invite people from work, even mentioning that he wanted to include my boss, I thought he was finally making an effort to be more social. I was actually touched by what seemed like genuine interest in making my birthday special. The party was scheduled for a Saturday evening at the community center downtown. James handled all the arrangements, which was unusual but not unprecedented. He was good at logistics when he put his mind to it. I spent the day getting ready, excited about celebrating with friends and family, looking forward to showing off the new dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. When I walked into the decorated hall and saw all those familiar faces, I felt genuinely loved and appreciated. Tiffany and Dylan were there, looking slightly uncomfortable, but making an effort to be festive. My boss had actually come, along with several colleagues, including Benjamin and Alice. James's friends and family filled out the crowd, and for a moment, I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. James waited until everyone had arrived, until we'd all had a drink and settled into party mode, before he stood up with a microphone. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate Emily's birthday," he began, and I beamed at him, thinking how handsome he looked when he made an effort. Emily loves surprises, as I'm sure you all know, and I have a very special surprise for her tonight. Something in his tone made me pause, but I was still smiling when he continued. "You know, after 22 years of marriage, you think you know everything about your spouse. But Emily has taught me that there are always surprises, and her cheating on me after 22 years of marriage was one of those surprises." The room went completely silent. I felt my face flush hot, then cold, as I tried to process what he'd just said. This had to be some kind of joke, some misguided attempt at humor that had fallen flat. But James wasn't smiling, and neither was anyone else. "I'd like you all to meet Benjamin," James continued, gesturing toward my colleague, who had gone pale as paper. "He's Emily's co-worker of about a decade, and he was close enough to us that I invited him to the party. Benjamin, would you like to tell everyone how close you and my wife have become?" I tried to stand, tried to grab the microphone, but James smoothly stepped away from me. "I have a slideshow prepared," he announced, and suddenly the lights dimmed and images began appearing on the screen behind him. Hotel receipts. Photographs of Benjamin and me entering and leaving various locations. Screenshots of text messages I'd thought were permanently deleted. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. I could see Alice staring at Benjamin with dawning horror, could see my own children looking at me like I was a stranger. My boss was taking notes in his phone, probably already planning the workplace investigation that would follow. "James, stop this," I managed to say, but my voice came out as a croak. "This isn't how we should handle this." "Handle what, Emily?" he asked, his voice perfectly calm. "Handle the fact that you've been lying to me for 3 years? Handle the fact that you've been using our marriage as cover while you conduct your affair? Or handle the fact that you looked me in the eye every single day and pretended to be someone you're not?" I wanted to explain, to tell everyone that it wasn't as simple as it looked, that there were reasons and complications they couldn't understand. But a man in a suit was suddenly beside me, handing me a manila envelope. "Emily Morrison?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered. "You've been served. Divorce papers. Have a nice evening." The party didn't last much longer after that. People began filing out in small groups, whispering among themselves, shooting looks of pity toward James and disgust toward me. Alice dragged Benjamin out without a word, though I could hear her voice rising in the parking lot. My boss left with a curt nod that told me my Monday morning was going to be very unpleasant. Tiffany and Dylan stayed until almost everyone else had gone, but they weren't there to comfort me. "How could you do this to Dad?" Tiffany demanded. "And how could you do this to us? Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" "You don't understand," I tried to explain. Your father and I have been having problems for years. This isn't just about Benjamin. Then you should have gotten divorced like an adult, Dylan said coldly. Instead of lying to everyone and making us all look like idiots. James refused to speak to me at all that night, despite my attempts to apologize and explain. He called me several choice adjectives that I won't repeat, told me he never wanted to hear my voice again, and left me standing in that empty community center with the remnants of my destroyed life scattered around me like confetti. The next few weeks were a nightmare of consequences I hadn't anticipated. My boss launched an immediate investigation into my relationship with Benjamin, since we'd clearly been conducting personal business on company time and property. I was suspended pending the outcome, which meant I went from having 2 relationships to having no job and no income in the span of a weekend. Benjamin was facing similar consequences at work, plus dealing with Alice's fury and his own children's confusion. He blamed me for not being more careful, for letting Ralph see us, for somehow causing this disaster that had destroyed both our marriages simultaneously. The man who had spent 3 years telling me I was the love of his life suddenly couldn't return my calls. Tiffany and Dylan were furious with both of us, but especially angry with James for his public humiliation tactics. You could have handled this privately, Tiffany told him during one of their arguments that I overheard through the lawyers. You didn't have to destroy Mom in front of everyone we know. But they were equally disgusted with me for the betrayal itself. Dylan stopped calling entirely for several months. Tiffany would answer my calls, but kept our conversations short and cold. I'd lost not just my husband but my relationship with my children, at least temporarily. The divorce proceedings were swift and brutal. James had documented everything so thoroughly that there was no point in fighting the evidence. His lawyer painted me as a calculating deceiver who had used our marriage as a cover for an extended affair, while systematically lying to everyone who trusted me. I tried to argue that James's public humiliation had been cruel and vindictive, that he could have confronted me privately and handled things with more dignity. But the judge seemed more interested in the 3 years of deception than the one night of public revelation. The financial settlement was fair by legal standards, but devastating to my actual life. James kept the house, but had to pay me half its value, which sounds generous until you realize I had to find somewhere to live while job hunting, with a scandal following me around. We split our savings, but there was no alimony since I was perfectly capable of working, assuming I could find someone willing to hire me after the workplace investigation concluded. The investigation at work dragged on for months. Benjamin and I were both transferred to different departments, which effectively ended our relationship anyway. It's hard to maintain a romantic connection with someone when you're both facing professional consequences for that same relationship. The passion that had sustained us through 3 years of secrecy couldn't survive the harsh light of public scrutiny and real-world consequences. I found a small apartment across town, started job hunting, tried to rebuild some kind of normal life from the wreckage of everything I'd destroyed. The loneliness was overwhelming. I'd gone from having a husband and a lover to having no one, from being part of a family to being the person everyone blamed for breaking that family apart. James moved on faster than I expected. Within 6 months, he was dating someone from his gym, a divorced woman with grown children who apparently thought his methodical approach to life was charming rather than suffocating. Seeing them together at Dylan's graduation party was harder than I'd anticipated. She looked at him the way I used to, before familiarity bred contempt and boredom. Benjamin's marriage to Alice didn't survive either, but he didn't come running back to me. Instead, he moved to another state for a fresh start, leaving me to face the consequences of our choices alone. 3 years of secret messages and stolen afternoons, and he couldn't even be bothered to say goodbye properly. The hardest part isn't the practical stuff. Finding a new job, adjusting to a smaller living space, managing on a single income. The hardest part is the way people look at me now, like I'm someone they need to be careful around. Friends who used to confide in me about their own marital problems now keep their distance, as if infidelity might be contagious. I understand that James felt betrayed and angry. I understand that discovering a 3-year affair would be devastating to anyone. But I still think there were better ways to handle it, ways that wouldn't have destroyed my reputation and my relationship with our children quite so thoroughly. The public humiliation felt vindictive, designed to punish me, rather than simply end our marriage. What I don't think anyone understands is how lonely I'd been in that marriage. How invisible I'd felt for so many years before Benjamin came along. James provided security and stability, but he'd stopped seeing me as a woman worth pursuing or appreciating. Benjamin made me feel alive again. Reminded me that I was more than just a wife and mother, going through the motions of a life that had lost its spark. I'm not proud of the deception, but I'm also not entirely sorry for finding happiness with someone who valued me. The lies were necessary because the truth would have hurt people unnecessarily. If James had been paying attention to our marriage instead of taking it for granted, maybe I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere for the connection and passion that were missing from our relationship. Now I'm starting over at 50, trying to build a new life from the pieces of the old one. It's not the future I planned, but it's not entirely without hope either. I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient than anyone gave me credit for. Maybe that's worth something, even if it came at a higher price than I expected to pay. The workplace investigation finally concluded with a formal reprimand and a permanent transfer, but I kept my job. Benjamin wasn't as lucky. He ended up resigning rather than face the ongoing scrutiny. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks it was worth it, if those 3 years of happiness were enough to balance the destruction that followed. I still think about him sometimes, about the way he used to look at me like I was the most fascinating woman in the world. James never looked at me that way. Not even in the beginning, when we were young and supposedly in love. Maybe that should have told me something about our marriage long before I decided to find that feeling elsewhere. The truth is, I don't regret loving Benjamin or being loved by him. I regret getting caught, regret the pain it caused our children, regret the way everything exploded so publicly and dramatically. But I don't regret those 3 years of feeling truly alive and appreciated and desired. Some people go their whole lives without experiencing that kind of connection, and I'm grateful I found it, even if I couldn't keep it.